Hi students, today we're going to learn the fifth supplementary lesson of 11th standard. The singing lesson, and it's written by Catherine Mansfield. You can see the picture, a lady teacher who teaches music, and students are standing in rows, and also you can see the musical notes there. Okay. Let's see something about the author. Kathleen Mansfield Murray, 1888 to 1923, was a New Zealand short story writer. She was from New Zealand and she used to write short stories. She wrote under the pen name Catherine Mansfield. Her original name was different from her pen name. When she writes a short story, she uses Catherine Mansfield. She left New Zealand at the age of 19 and settled in the United Kingdom, where she gained the friendship of great writers such as D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. So she left New Zealand at the age of 19 and she went and settled in United Kingdom. There she had to meet great writers and got the friendship of them, D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. Bliss and the Garden Party were collections of short stories written by her. So these are the short stories, collection of short stories, Bliss and the Garden Party. She wrote many poems and her collected letters were great success. So apart from short stories, she also had written poems and her collected letters were also of great success. Okay. Let's see about the meanings given at the end of the lesson. Baton, a thick, thin stick used by a conductor of a music orchestra. You might have seen the music director holding a small stick like thing, that is to conduct the music orchestra. Drawl is slow, lazy way of talking. How are you? It's something different from how you, drawl. Tangles, a confused mass or something twisted, entangled. Okay. Grimace, expression of disgust on a person's face. Accompaniments, music played to support an instrument, voice, or group. Accompaniment, if there is a main instrument played, there are certain accompaniments, guitar, bass guitar, and lead guitar, and other piano as accompaniments. Those instruments that are supporting the main instruments are called accompaniments, that may be in the instrument or voice or group. Contralto, the lowest female voice. They sing in their bass voice, the lowest female voice. Fourth, a musical tone played loudly. It's a tone, musical tone. Crescendo means a gradual increase in the loudness of sound. There will be a gradual increase in the sound of the singing. They start soft, and as it goes on, as the song goes on, the sound increases. It increases gradually. Aisle, a passage between rows of seats. Fiancé, a man to whom one is engaged to be married. Not married, but just engaged. Doleful is sorrowful. Okay, let's move on to the lesson. Before we move on to the lesson, just look at the picture. This is a lady who holds a stick-like thing, no, which I said baton. Using that only they conduct the musical orchestra. That is baton. Okay, and this is a girl who is on the piano. This is chrysanthemum, yellow chrysanthemum. It's a flower. And this face doesn't give a natural or a pleasing smile, it's a grimace. Just a smile, but it's very artificial. Okay? And to know the meaning for aisle, between two rows there is a space. Likewise, here in this lesson, the main character uh, walks through the aisle. Aisle, S is silent here. Okay, and this is the hat stand, and the right side is the bookcase. Okay, when we come across hat stand, bookcase, and baton, and just please remind of these, remember these images. Okay, let's move on to the lesson, the singing lesson by Catherine Mansfield. Warm up. What are all the factors that influence our moods? Many things. If something good happens, our mood is very happy. If something affects our mood, we become very moody. Our thoughts become very gloomy. How do you behave under the spells of different moods? Yes, according to the moods, we behave. Do you think it is important not to be swayed by every passing mood? Yes, it is important, but it is not that easy. To overcome or to be swayed by every passing mood. Uh, that is that's a skill. Not expressing on our face, not allowing the impact of the mood to spoil our you know life. That is something very important, but it is very difficult. That will be very obvious in some of our faces. If we are very, very sad, people will ask, why are you so sad? What happens? That is obviously seen on our face. Suggest some ways by which we can maintain a calm temperament under all circumstances. If I ask this question to our students, they would say that we need to practice yoga to control our attitude or something. There's so many other tips you could give, but this lesson, the singing lesson in which the attitude of an aggrieved music teacher undergoes a drastic change in keeping with her moods. So, how a lady undergoes a drastic change in keeping with her moods is being given in this lesson. Okay. With despair, cold, sharp despair buried deep in her heart like a wicked knife, Miss Meadows, in cap and gown and carrying a little baton, trod the cold corridors that led to the music hall. Okay, with despair. Despair means loss of hope, no hope. In a very disappointed, discouraged situation, very cold, short despair, sharp despair. She is buried deep in her heart like a wicked knife. No, she comes, this character, Miss Meadows, walks with a cap and gown, and she was also carrying a little baton. She's walking by the cold corridors that led to the music hall. A lady, a music teacher, walking with discouraged mood, with a cap and a gown, and entering the music hall. Girls of all ages, rosy from the air and bubbling over with that gleeful excitement that comes from running to school on a fine autumn morning, hurried, skipped, fluttered by. From the hollow classrooms came a quick drumming of voices. A bell rang, a voice like a bird cried, Muriel. Okay, so inside the classroom, so girls of all ages, in music classes, you can have different age group. fifth standard, eighth standard, or even elderly people can join the music class. Rosy from the air, their faces are very bright. They are bubbling over with gleeful excitement. They are very joyful, and that comes from running to school. During this autumn season, going to school definitely makes someone very excited. So they are very much hurried and they're just jumping here and there, fluttering, all are excited about the music class. And from the classrooms came a quick drumming of voices. So a lot of voices comes from that hollow classroom. And that's when a bell rang. And that's when, during the bell, a voice cried, Muriel, name of a person. And then there came from the staircase a tremendous knock, knock, knocking. What happened? Why does knock, knock, knocking sound? Someone had dropped dumbbells. Dumbbells, musical instrument, someone had dropped and it is falling down the staircase with knock, knock, knocking sound. Okay, the science mistress stopped Miss Meadows. So Miss Meadows was walking to get into the music classroom. And in the opposite direction, the science mistress stopped Miss Meadows and she said, Good morning, in a sweet, affected drawl. So, how she should have said, drawl, in a lazy way of talking. Good morning. Isn't it cold? It might be winter. She was drawling in her words. And Miss Meadows, hugging the knife, that means her heart was almost cut. Something was affecting her mood. So in that situation, stared in hatred at the science mistress. She was not having a pleasant look at that science mistress. She had that hatred in the look at the science mistress. Everything about her was. How about the science mistress? She was sweet, she was fair, she was like honey. No, you wouldn't have been surprised to see a bee caught in the tangles of the yellow hair. So her hair was very, very thick and curly. Even if a bee enters, that would get caught. Such thick yellow hair, and such a sweet person was Miss Science Mistress, the Science Mistress. And for that question, Miss Meadows answered, It is rather sharp. Because a question was, Isn't it cold? Yes, it is rather sharp. It is very cold. And she had that grim face when she said that. No, not with a smile. The other smiled, a sugary smile. The science mistress gave a pleasing smile, but not Miss Meadows. And that's why science mistress asked, You look frozen, said she. Blue eyes opened wide. There came a mocking light in them. Had you noticed anything? She said, the science mistress said, Look frozen. Why? You are tightened, you are tensed. And her blue eyes opened wide. There came a mocking light in them. In her eyes, there was a sort of mockery. And Miss Meadows thought, had she noticed anything? Did she come to know anything that was going through in my mind? And for which Miss Meadows says like this, Oh, not quite as bad as that. Nothing bad as that, said Miss Meadows. And she gave the science mistress in exchange for her smile a quick grimace and passed on. She just gave an artificial smile and just moved off from that place. Okay. Forms 4, 5, and 6 were assembled in the music hall. The noise was deafening. On the platform by the piano stood Mary Beasley, Miss Meadows' favorite, who played accompaniments. So there are different forms, there are different levels or rows. Forms 4, 5, and 6 all were assembled in the music hall. They were making hell of noise. The noise was deafening. So on the platform by the piano stood a girl, Mary Beasley, and she was Miss Meadows' favorite, and she was playing the accompaniment. These Choir was singing and she was playing the accompaniment. She was turning the music stool. When she saw Miss Meadows, she gave a loud warning. Shh, girls! Miss Meadows, her hands thrust in her sleeves, the baton under her arms, strode down the center aisle, mounted the steps, turned sharply, seized the brass music stand, planted it in front of her, and gave two sharp taps with the baton for silence. So Mary Beasley warned all the students about Miss Meadows coming. As soon as Miss Meadows came, her hands were thrust in her sleeves. She took the baton and kept it under her arm. She strode down the center aisle. Very fastly she walked in the aisle. I told you, no, in the image I showed the aisle between the rows, the space between the rows. She just walked there, mounted the steps, turned sharply, took the brass music stand. She kept that in front of her and gave two sharp taps with a baton. What for? Not to begin the music, but to maintain silence. And she shouted also, "Silence, please!" Immediately. And looking at nobody, her glance swept over the sea of colored flannel blouses with bobbing pink faces and hands skewering butterfly hair bows and music books outspread. She knew perfectly well what they were thinking. Betty is in a wax? Well, let them think it. Her eyelids quivered. She tossed her head, defying them. What could the thoughts of those creatures matter to someone who stood there bleeding to death, pierced to the heart by such a letter? And as soon as she took the music stand and gave a sign for silence, she shouted also, "Silence, please!" Immediately. She didn't look at anybody. But her glance was at the things that were around: flannel blouse, bobbing pink faces and hands, quivering butterfly hair bows, and music books outspread. Not on the girls, those who were singing, no. So something was going on in the mind. And what might be the thoughts of the students? Medi is in a wax? Is she confused? Why she's tensed like this? But Miss Meadow is thinking, let them think anything, not a problem. What could the thoughts of those creatures matter to someone who stood there bleeding to death? But my heart is paining. Something pains my heart, pierced to the heart by such a letter. What is that, by such a letter? What happens with a letter, and what has this letter to do with that piercing of her heart? Someone wrote a letter, and that has affected the mood of Miss Meadows. Okay, what is that letter all about? These are the words that in the letter. I feel more and more strongly that our marriage would be a mistake. So what are the words in the letter? Strong belief of someone saying that their marriage is going to be a mistake. Not that I do not love you. Someone is writing that someone is loving Miss Meadows. I love you as much as it is possible for me to love any woman. No, I can love any person, so and so I can love you also. But the problem is, what is that? The continuation of the letter. But truth to tell, I have come to the conclusion that I am not a marrying man. So in this letter, someone who has been loving Miss Meadows has written that he is not going to be a marrying man. And the idea of settling down fills me with nothing but the word disgust was scratched out lightly and regret written over the top. He has written this letter and he is telling idea of marrying and settling down seems to be disgust, something which is to be hated. So slightly disgust, the word disgust was scratched lightly, and instead of that word disgust, he wrote regret over the top of that scratching. These are the words in the letter, and this letter, after reading this letter, Miss Meadows' heart was pierced as if it was pierced with a knife. So we can understand that someone has been loving her, but through this letter, it is very clear that he doesn't want to marry Miss Meadows. That is why the mood of Miss Meadows has been changed. She is behaving very indifferently, very differently, not showing any interest. Her mood was very troubled by this letter. Who is that person? Who wrote these words? He is none other than Basil. Miss Meadows stalked over to the piano, and Mary Beasley, who was waiting for this moment, bent forward. Her curls fell over the cheeks while she breathed, "Good morning, Miss Meadows." And she motioned towards, rather than handed to her mistress, a beautiful yellow chrysanthemum. I showed that in the picture. So, Mary Beasley, the girl who is playing the accompaniment, as soon as Miss Meadows entered, she bent forward and the curls of her hair fell over her cheeks. While she breathed, she said very softly, "Good morning, Miss Meadows," as if she was breathing. And she motioned towards, rather than handed to her mistress, a beautiful yellow chrysanthemum. This is very normal. This little ritual of the flower had been gone through for ages and ages. As soon as she enters, Miss Meadows enters, Mary Bisley would go and give her a flower. That's happening for so many days. And even today, that happened. It was as much part of the lesson as opening the piano. How they start by opening the lesson of the piano, this particular ritual also happens every day. Mary Beasley's giving of flower to Miss Meadows. But this morning, usually what she used to do, instead of taking it up, instead of tucking it into her belt, while she leaned over Mary and said, "Thank you, Mary. How very nice." Turn to page 32. What was Mary's horror when Miss Meadows totally ignored the chrysanthemum, made no reply to her greeting. Usually what happens? She takes the flower and keeps it and enjoys that, and she says thank you, and she usually turns all the students' attention to page number 32. But today, totally, she ignored the chrysanthemum. She doesn't got that with a smile. She just ignored the chrysanthemum, and she made no reply to her greetings. "Good morning, Miss Meadows." No reply, but said in a voice of ice, not page 32. She used to tell page 32, but now page 14, please, and mark the accents well. She was very rough in her voice. Staggering woman. Staggering moment. Mary blushed until the tears stood in her eyes. But Miss Meadows was gone back to the music stand. Her voice rang through the music hall. Mary blushed until the tears stood in her eyes. It was a staggering moment. She never experienced such time when she offered a chrysanthemum. But this time she was almost in tears. But Miss Meadows was gone back to the music stand. A voice rang through the music hall. What is that? Page 14. We will begin with page 14, a lament. Now, girls, you ought to know it by this time. We shall take it all together, not in parts, all together, and without expression. Sing it, though quite simply, beating time with the left hand. So her voice was very rough, and she used to point out the page 32, but now page 14. It was a sad song, a lament. It was a lament. It was not a joyful song. And she's telling, you ought to know it by this time. You should have been thorough with this by this time. We have been doing that for a long time. So we shall take it all together, not in parts. Songs can be sung in parts, soprano, tenor, bass, something like that, all together. But she doesn't want that parts to be. And without expression, sing it quite simply, but you must beat time with the left hand. That's what she said. And she raised the baton. She tapped the music stand twice. Down came Mary on the opening chord. Down came all those left hands, beating the air and enchimed those young, mournful voices. So, as soon as she raised the baton, Mary started, her hands come down on the piano, and all the girls' hands came down with the timing beat, beating the time. They started, but all the young girls, now they are mournful, charming young girls. They used to sing charming, delightful songs, but now they are singing mournful songs. What are the lines of the song? Fast heart, too fast fade the ruses of pleasure. Soon autumn yields unto winter drear. Fleetly, fleetly, music's gay measure passes away from the listening ear. These are the lines in page 14, a lament. Don't forget these words, because in between every thoughts of Miss Meadows, these words would come. Okay? They are singing a lament. Lament. When someone dies, there would be group of grandmothers would be lamenting on the death of the person. You know? Likewise, fast, too fast, fade the roses, something like that. I'm horrible, but they would be singing with notes, but it is a lament. It was a lament. Good heavens, what could be more tragic than the lament, than that lament? Every note was a sigh, a sob, a groan, or awful mournfulness. So these girls were praying to God, good heavens, what could be more tragic? Nothing could be so tragic than singing this song, a lament. Every note of that song was full of sorrow, groaning, awful mournfulness. Miss Meadows lifted her arms in the white gown and began conducting with both hands. Suddenly, the thought is coming of her fiancé. I feel more and more strongly that her marriage would be a mistake. You understand? These are the words in the letter that comes. She beat. And the voices cried, fleetly, oh, fleetly. Suddenly, again, her mind goes into the letter. What could have possessed him to write such a letter? What could have led up to it? It came out of nothing. His last letter had been all about a fumed oak bookcase he had bought for our books at a natty little hall stand. He had seen a very neat affair with a carved owl on a bracket holding 3 hat brushes in its claws. How she had smiled at that. So like a man to think one needed 3 hat brushes. From the listening ear sang the voices. So all the words of that letter affects her mood. And she is thinking, why? What could have possessed him to write such a letter? Why did he write such a letter? It just came out of nothing. I never expected. There was nothing happened for such a letter. He bought so many things for me to make me happy. Bookcase and the little hall stand. carved owl of a bracket holding three hat brushes in his claws. And whatever he bought, I was smiling at that. She was, as she was thinking, these girls are singing, from the listening ear, sang the voices. Once again said Miss Meadows, but this time in parts, still without expression. She's not able to come out of that mood, which was affected by the letter by Basil, her fiancé. She's asking them to sing once again, but this time not together, in parts, but still without expression. So the girls started singing, fast or too fast. With the gloom of the contraltos added, one could scarcely help shuddering. It was almost like a cry. The lines of the song, fade the roses of pleasure. Suddenly the thought comes of Basil. Last time he had come to see her, Basil had worn a rose in his buttonhole. How handsome he had looked in that bright blue suit with a dark red rose. And he knew it too. He couldn't help knowing it. So immediately she thought of how last time Basil came with a suit. What color? Bright blue suit. He was also wearing a rose in his buttonhole. How handsome he looked with a dark red rose. He also knew, he himself knew that he was looking handsome. He couldn't help knowing it. First, he stroked his hair, then his mush. His teeth gleamed when he smiled. In that suit, with that rose, he stroked his hair stylishly, and then he touched his mush, and he gave a smile. And in that smile, I could see all his teeth gleamed. And he also said something. The headmaster's wife keeps on asking me to dinner. It's a perfect nuisance. I never get an evening to myself in that place. No, he was complaining about the headmaster's wife. She was calling Basil for a dinner, and that was a perfect nuisance for him. So even for himself, he couldn't find an evening to spend because he was very busy. And then even at that time, that means Miss Meadows, said, why don't you refuse it? For that which he said, oh well, it doesn't do for a man in my position to be unpopular. I couldn't resist because I was a decent person. I was a man of that caliber. She was thinking all those that happened when he came in that suit in an handsome manner. Suddenly, music's gay measure wailed the voices. The willow trees outside the high, narrow windows waved in the wind. They had lost off their leaves. The tiny ones that clung wriggled like fishes caught on a line. I am not a marrying man. The voices were silent. The piano waited. So, see the change of the mood. Sometimes of the words that are there in the letter. Sometimes that what had happened when he came to visit her. And suddenly, what is happening outside? The willow trees outside the high, narrow windows waved in the wind. They had lost off their leaves. And suddenly the lines of Basil, I am not a marrying man. By the time the voices of the choir were silent because they had finished singing the second time, the piano also waited. So let us also wait for the second part of the video. We'll continue in the second part.